In a small, peaceful town, nestled between golden hills and whispering olive trees, there lived a man known to everyone simply as Juha. He was not the richest man in town, nor was he the poorest. He was not the tallest, nor was he the shortest. But he was, without any doubt, the cleverest man anyone had ever met. His wit was sharper than a barber's blade, and his tongue could turn any argument upside down before his opponent even realized what had happened. Juha lived in a modest house made of brown clay bricks, with a small courtyard where a single fig tree stood proudly in the center. He loved that fig tree more than anything else he owned. Every morning he would sit beneath its generous shade, sip his tea slowly, and listen to the birds singing their morning songs. Life was simple, life was calm, and Juha wanted nothing more than to keep it exactly that way. But fate, as it often does, had a very different plan for poor Juha. One hot afternoon in the middle of summer, a large wooden cart pulled by two tired donkeys stopped right in front of the empty house next to Juha's home. That house had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since old Uncle Mahmud had passed away, and nobody in the town had bothered to buy it. Juha had enjoyed the silence that came with having no neighbor. He could sing loudly without anyone complaining. He could talk to his donkey without anyone calling him crazy. He could even sleep on his rooftop under the stars without hearing a single sound except the gentle wind. But now, someone was moving in. Juha stood at his doorway and watched curiously as a big man with a thick black beard and arms like tree trunks jumped off the cart. The man was wearing a bright red turban that was far too large for his head and a green robe that was far too tight for his enormous body. Behind him came a thin woman carrying a baby, followed by 6 children of various sizes, all of them screaming and chasing each other around the cart like wild animals released from a cage. The big man noticed Juha standing at his door and immediately marched toward him with a wide grin that showed several missing teeth. He grabbed Juha's hand and shook it so hard that Juha felt his entire skeleton rattle inside his body. "Greetings, neighbor. My name is Hassoon ibn Khalaf ibn Dawood. We are your new neighbors, and I can already tell that you and I are going to be the best of friends." The man bellowed in a voice so loud that 3 birds fell off the fig tree in shock. Juha forced a polite smile and tried to free his crushed hand from Hassoon's iron grip. "Welcome, welcome, neighbor Hassoon. I hope you and your family will find peace and comfort in your new home," Juha said, though deep inside his heart a small voice was already whispering warnings. The very first night proved that the small voice was absolutely right.
At exactly midnight, just as Juha had finally fallen into a deep and beautiful sleep, a thunderous banging erupted on his front door. Juha leaped out of bed so fast that he tripped over his own shoes and crashed face first into the wall. His heart was pounding like a drum as he stumbled to the door, convinced that robbers were attacking or that the town was on fire. He opened the door to find Hassoon standing there in his nightclothes, grinning his toothless grin, holding an empty clay pot in his hands. "Good evening, dear neighbor. I am terribly sorry to disturb you at this late hour, but my wife wants to cook soup and we have run out of salt. Could you lend us a small cup of salt? Just a tiny amount. I promise we will return it first thing in the morning," Hassoon said cheerfully, as if knocking on someone's door at midnight for salt was the most normal thing in the entire world. Juha stared at him for a long moment. His left eye twitched slightly. Then he took a deep breath, went inside, filled the pot with salt, and handed it back to Hassoon without saying a single word. "You are a true gentleman, Juha, a prince among men. I knew the moment I saw your face that you were a man of extraordinary generosity," Hassoon announced loudly enough for the entire neighborhood to hear, and then he disappeared into the darkness. Juha closed his door, walked slowly back to his bed, and lay down, staring at the ceiling. "It is just salt," he whispered to himself. "The man is new here. He is still settling in. Things will get better. I must be patient and kind." But things did not get better. Things got worse. Much, much worse. The next morning, before the rooster had even opened its eyes to crow, Hassoon was at Juha's door again. This time, he needed to borrow flour. An hour later, he came back for eggs. Before noon, he returned asking for onions. By sunset, he had visited Juha's house 11 separate times, each time borrowing something different, and each time promising to return everything soon. Juha sat under his fig tree that evening, completely exhausted, and looked up at the sky. "Dear God," he said quietly, "I have always been a patient man, but I have a feeling that my patience is about to be tested in ways I have never imagined." He had no idea how right he was, because what Hassoon had planned next would make the borrowing seem like a minor inconvenience, and that is exactly what Juha would discover the very next morning.
3 weeks had passed since Hassoon moved in next door, and Juha's peaceful life had been completely shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. Every single day brought a new annoyance, a new disruption, a new reason for Juha to lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling and questioning what he had done to deserve such a neighbor. The borrowing had never stopped. In fact, it had only grown worse. Hassoon had borrowed so many things from Juha that Juha started keeping a list on a long piece of paper that now stretched from his kitchen wall all the way down to the floor. Salt, sugar, flour, eggs, oil, bread, cheese, tea, cups, plates, spoons, a blanket, a pillow, a chair, a cooking pot, a broom, and even Juha's favorite pair of sandals. Not a single item had been returned, not one. But Juha, being the patient and clever man that he was, decided to handle the situation with wisdom rather than anger. One morning, he walked over to Hassoon's house, carrying a small notebook and a calm smile on his face. "Good morning, dear neighbor Hassoon," Juha said pleasantly. "I have come to kindly remind you about the items you have borrowed over the past few weeks. I have written them all down here in this notebook, and I was hoping we could arrange a time for you to return them." Hassoon looked at the notebook, then looked at Juha, and then burst into laughter, so loud that his baby started crying inside the house, and a stray cat on the roof jumped 3 feet into the air. "Oh, Juha, 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 you are such a funny man. Between neighbors, we do not count and measure these small things. What is mine is yours, and what is yours is mine. That is the true spirit of neighborly love, is it not?" Hassoon slapped Juha on the back so hard that Juha nearly swallowed his own tongue. Before Juha could respond, Hassoon leaned in closer with a serious expression on his face. "But since you are here, my dear friend, I actually need to discuss something very important with you, something much bigger than cups and spoons." Juha felt a cold chill run down his spine, despite the burning summer heat. "What is it?" he asked cautiously, the way a man might ask a doctor about a mysterious pain in his chest. Hassoon pointed at the old mud wall that separated their two properties. The wall was ancient, cracked in several places, and leaning slightly to one side, like a tired old man who had been standing too long. It had been there since before Juha was born, and it had clearly marked the boundary between the two houses for decades. "This wall," Hassoon declared dramatically, spreading his arms wide, "is a problem, a big problem. You see, Juha, I have been studying it carefully, and I have come to the conclusion that this wall is actually built 2 feet inside my property. That means 2 feet of my land is on your side, 2 feet that rightfully belong to me." Juha's eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. He looked at the wall, then at Hassoon, then at the wall again. He had lived in his house for over 20 years. His father had lived there before him. His grandfather had built that wall with his own hands. Every single person in the town knew exactly where the boundary was. There was absolutely no question about it. "Hassoon," Juha said slowly, choosing his words very carefully, "that wall was built by my grandfather 60 years ago. The boundary has never changed. Every elder in this town can confirm this. I have the original property documents inside my house. The wall is exactly where it should be." Hassoon shook his head stubbornly and crossed his massive arms over his chest. "Documents can be wrong, Juha. Elders can forget. But the land does not lie. I measured it myself with my own rope, and I am telling you that 2 feet of my land is on your side. I want it back." Juha took a very deep breath. He counted to 10 inside his head. Then he counted to 10 again. Then he counted to 20 just to be safe. Let us not argue about this, Hassoon. Let us go to the town judge and let him settle the matter fairly. Whatever he decides, I will accept without question.
Hassoon agreed, and the very next day, both men stood before Judge Karim, the oldest and most respected judge in the entire region. Judge Karim was a thin, quiet man with a long white beard and eyes that could see through lies the way sunlight passes through clear water. He listened carefully to both sides, examined Juha's property documents, called 3 elderly witnesses who all confirmed that the wall had always been in the correct position, and then delivered his verdict. The wall stands where it has always stood. The boundary is correct. Hassoon has no claim to any additional land. Case dismissed, Judge Karim announced firmly, striking his wooden desk with a small hammer. Juha felt a wave of relief wash over him like cool water on a hot day. He thanked the judge, nodded politely to Hassoon, and walked home feeling victorious. He sat under his beloved fig tree, poured himself a cup of tea, and smiled peacefully. That is the end of that, he said to himself with satisfaction. The matter is settled. The law has spoken. Even Hassoon cannot argue with the judge. But Juha had underestimated his neighbor in a way he would deeply regret. That very night, Juha was awakened by strange sounds coming from outside his window. It was not knocking this time. It was something far more disturbing. It was the sound of scraping, digging, and heavy breathing. Juha crept to his window and peered out into the moonlit courtyard. What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. There was Hassoon, shirtless and sweating under the silver moonlight, using a large shovel to dig at the base of the boundary wall. He was removing the foundation stones one by one, carefully loosening the earth beneath them. The wall was already tilting dangerously, leaning further toward Juha's side than ever before. "What are you doing?" Juha shouted from his window, his voice cracking with disbelief. Hassoon looked up calmly, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and smiled his gap-toothed smile. "I am not touching the wall, dear neighbor. I am simply gardening on my side of the property. A man has every right to dig in his own soil, does he not? If the wall happens to fall because it is old and weak, well, that is not my fault. That is simply nature taking its course." Juha stood frozen at his window, his hands gripping the wooden frame so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He understood now exactly what Hassoon was doing. The man could not move the wall through the law, so he had decided to destroy it instead. And once the wall collapsed, Hassoon would rebuild it 2 feet further into Juha's property and claim that was where it had always been. It was a cunning, devious, and absolutely infuriating plan. Juha closed his window slowly and sat on the edge of his bed in the darkness. His mind was racing faster than a horse at full gallop. He knew that confronting Hassoon directly would lead nowhere. The man was bigger, louder, and more stubborn than a mule stuck in mud. Going back to the judge would take weeks, and by then the wall would already be a pile of rubble on the ground. No, this situation required something different. This situation required the kind of clever thinking that only Juha was capable of producing. He needed a plan so brilliant, so unexpected, that Hassoon would never see it coming. And by the time the first rays of dawn began to creep across the sky, painting the room in shades of soft gold, Juha had his plan. A slow, wide grin spread across his face as he whispered to the morning light, "You want to play games, Hassoon? Very well. Let us play. But I should warn you, I have never lost a game in my entire life." What Juha was about to do would leave the entire town talking for years, and Hassoon would learn a lesson he would never forget. But first, Juha needed to visit the marketplace, buy 3 very specific items, and have a private conversation with his donkey.
The morning sun had barely risen above the hilltops when Juha was already on his feet, dressed in his cleanest robe and walking briskly toward the town marketplace, with a determined look in his eyes that his donkey had never seen before. The donkey, whose name was Bashir, trotted beside him with a confused expression on his long gray face, as if he could sense that his master was about to do something either extremely clever or extremely foolish, and possibly both at the same time. The marketplace was already buzzing with activity. Merchants were shouting about their fresh vegetables, women were arguing over the price of fabric, and children were weaving between the stalls like tiny fish swimming through a coral reef. Juha ignored all of it. He walked straight to 3 specific shops, bought 3 specific items, and stuffed them carefully into a large cloth bag without letting anyone see what was inside. The first item was a large bag of the finest, most expensive honey in the entire market. The golden liquid was so thick and sweet that even the bees who made it were jealous. The second item was a bundle of strong, thin rope, the kind that fishermen use to tie their boats to the dock. The third item was a small brass bell, the kind that shopkeepers hung above their doors to announce when a customer entered. Bashir, the donkey, looked at the strange collection of items and let out a long, skeptical bray that roughly translated to, "What on earth are you planning, old man?" Juha patted him gently on the nose and whispered, "Patience, my friend. By tonight, our neighbor Hassoon will wish he had never heard the name Juha." When Juha returned home, he immediately noticed that the boundary wall was leaning even more than before. Hassoon had clearly continued his secret digging during the early morning hours. Several more foundation stones had been loosened, and a thin crack now ran from the bottom of the wall all the way to the top, like a lightning bolt frozen in mud. If nothing was done, the wall would collapse within 2 or 3 days at most. But Juha did not panic. Instead, he smiled. He spent the rest of the morning preparing the first phase of his plan. He took the large bag of honey and carefully poured it along the entire base of the wall on his side of the property. He spread it thick and generous, making sure every inch of ground near the wall was covered in the sticky golden liquid. Then he went inside his house and waited. He did not have to wait long. By early afternoon, the honey had done exactly what Juha knew it would do. It had attracted every ant, every fly, every wasp, and every bee within a mile of the neighborhood. Thousands upon thousands of insects swarmed around the base of the wall, creating a buzzing, crawling carpet of tiny creatures that made the ground look like it was alive and moving. The sweet smell drifted over the wall and into Hassoon's courtyard, and soon the insects followed. Within an hour, Hassoon's wife was screaming. Within 2 hours, his children were crying. Within 3 hours, Hassoon himself came storming out of his house, slapping at wasps that were dive-bombing his enormous head like tiny angry soldiers attacking a fortress. "Juha! Juha!" Hassoon roared over the wall, his face red and swollen from multiple stings. "What have you done? There are insects everywhere in my house. My wife cannot cook. My children cannot sleep. My baby has been stung 4 times on the nose." Juha appeared at his window with a look of pure innocence on his face, the kind of innocence that only a truly guilty man can produce. "Oh dear, how terrible! Insect, you say? How strange. I simply spilled some honey near the wall while I was carrying it to my kitchen. Clumsy me. But you know how it is, Hassoon. These things happen naturally. It is simply nature taking its course. A man has every right to carry honey on his own property, does he not?" Hassoon's left eye twitched violently. He recognized his own words being thrown back at him like stones from a catapult, and he did not enjoy the taste of his own medicine one bit. He opened his mouth to argue, but at that exact moment, a large wasp landed directly on his tongue. He yelped, spat, and retreated back into his house, slamming the door so hard that a piece of plaster fell from the ceiling inside. Juha allowed himself a small, quiet chuckle, but he knew the honey was only the beginning. It was merely a distraction, a way to keep Hassoon busy and irritated while Juha prepared the real trap. Phase 1 was complete. Now it was time for Phase 2.
That night, after darkness had swallowed the town and every lamp had been blown out, Juha crept silently into his courtyard with the bundle of thin rope and the small brass bell. He climbed his fig tree with the agility of a man half his age, crawled along a thick branch that extended over the boundary wall, and carefully tied the rope to the highest point of the wall on Hassun's side. He then ran the rope along the top of the wall, through a small hole he had drilled earlier in his own fence, and connected it to the brass bell that he hung just outside his bedroom window. The design was simple but brilliant. If anyone touched the wall, moved a single stone, or even breathed too heavily near it, the rope would vibrate and the brass bell would ring, waking Juha immediately. It was an alarm system, primitive but perfectly effective, and Hassun would never know it existed because the thin rope was nearly invisible in the darkness. But Juha was not finished yet. The most important part of his plan had nothing to do with honey, ropes, or bells. It had to do with something far more powerful, something that could defeat even the strongest and most stubborn man alive. It had to do with the law, and more specifically, with a very old and very forgotten law that Juha had remembered while lying awake in bed the previous night. Years ago, when Juha was a young student, he had spent countless hours reading old legal books in the town library. Most people found legal books boring, but Juha found them fascinating because hidden within those dusty pages were rules and regulations that most people had completely forgotten about. And one particular law had suddenly jumped back into his memory like a fish leaping out of a river. The law stated that if a man deliberately caused damage to a shared boundary wall, he would not only be required to rebuild it at his own expense in its original position, but he would also be required to surrender a strip of his own land 3 feet wide to his neighbor as compensation for the trouble and damage caused. The law was ancient, written over 200 years ago, but it had never been officially removed from the legal books, which meant it was still technically valid and enforceable. Juha's plan was now crystal clear. He needed to catch Hassun in the act of destroying the wall. He needed witnesses, he needed evidence, and then he would take Hassun back to Judge Karim, present the old law, and not only save his wall, but actually gain 3 feet of Hassun's land in the process. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Hassun had absolutely no idea what was coming. The next 2 nights were quiet. The bell did not ring. Hassun was apparently too busy dealing with the insect invasion to continue his digging. His wife had threatened to take the children and go back to her mother's house if the bugs were not gone by the end of the week, and Hassun was spending every waking moment trying to clean the honey residue and chase away the stubborn swarms that had now made his courtyard their permanent home. But Juha knew that Hassun's patience with the wall situation would return eventually. The man was greedy and stubborn, and greed and stubbornness together are a combination that never gives up easily. Juha simply had to wait and be ready. And on the 3rd night, just as the moon reached its highest point in the sky and the town lay silent beneath a blanket of silver light, the brass bell outside Juha's window began to ring. Softly at first, then louder, then continuously, filling the quiet night with its sharp metallic voice. Juha's eyes snapped open. His heart began to pound. He rose from his bed slowly, carefully, and crept to his window. Through the thin curtain, he could see the massive shadow of Hassun hunched over the base of the wall, shovel in hand, digging furiously like a dog burying a bone. Perfect, Juha whispered into the darkness, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man whose trap had finally been sprung. He pulled on his robe, lit a small candle, and slipped out of his house through the back door to set the final phase of his plan into motion, a phase that would require the help of 3 very specific people who were already expecting his late-night visit.
Juha moved through the dark streets of the sleeping town like a shadow gliding across water. His sandals made no sound against the dusty ground, and his breathing was slow and controlled, the breathing of a man who knew that every second mattered and every step had to be perfectly calculated. The small candle in his hand flickered nervously in the night breeze, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the silent houses that lined the narrow streets. His first stop was the home of Abu Salam, the town's most respected elder and a man whose word carried more weight than a mountain. Abu Salam was 73 years old, had a beard that reached his belt, and had served as a witness in more legal disputes than anyone could count. When Abu Salam said he saw something, no judge in the entire region would dare question his testimony. Juha knocked 3 soft knocks on Abu Salam's wooden door, exactly as they had arranged 2 days earlier. Within moments, the door creaked open, and the old man appeared, already fully dressed and wearing his formal white turban, as if he had been waiting by the door all night. "Is it happening?" Abu Salam whispered, his ancient eyes sharp and alert despite the late hour. "It is happening right now," Juha confirmed. "He is digging at the wall as we speak." Abu Salam nodded once, firmly, and stepped outside. "Let us collect the others." The second stop was the home of Omar the carpenter, a broad-shouldered man with hands rougher than tree bark and a reputation for absolute honesty that was known throughout 3 neighboring towns. Omar had built half the houses in the village and knew every wall, every boundary, and every property line better than he knew the lines on his own palms. When Juha had visited him 2 days ago and explained the situation, he agreed immediately to serve as a witness, his face darkening with anger at the idea of a man trying to steal his neighbor's land through deception. Omar was waiting at his gate, arms crossed, jaw set firm like a man ready for battle. He fell into step beside Juha and Abu Salam without a word, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel with the steady rhythm of a war drum. The third and final stop was the most important one. It was the home of Fatima, the town's unofficial record keeper and the only woman in the entire region who could read and write better than most scholars. Fatima was a widow in her 50s who had inherited her late husband's vast collection of legal documents, land records, and historical maps. When Juha had visited her earlier that week and told her about the ancient law regarding boundary wall destruction, she had spent 2 full days searching through her husband's archives until she found the original document written on yellowed parchment in ink that had faded but was still perfectly readable. "I found 2 additional supporting documents," Fatima whispered as she joined the group. "Previous cases where this exact law was applied. In both cases, the offender lost 3 feet of his land to his neighbor. The law is unquestionable." Juha felt a surge of gratitude so strong that he almost hugged her right there in the street. "Fatima, you are worth more than 1,000 lawyers," he said sincerely. "I know," she replied, without a hint of modesty, and the 4 of them turned and walked swiftly back toward Juha's house. When they arrived, Juha led the group through his back door and into his dark courtyard. The sound of digging was immediately audible, a rhythmic scraping and thudding that echoed through the still night air like the heartbeat of some underground beast. They crept toward the boundary wall and peered through the cracks. The sight was exactly what Juha had expected, but still shocking to witness in person. Hassoun was drenched with sweat, his massive body hunched over the base of the wall, working his shovel with the frantic energy of a man possessed. He had already removed at least 8 more foundation stones and piled them neatly to the side. The wall was now leaning at a dangerous angle, and a large section near the middle had developed a crack so wide that you could fit your entire hand inside. 1 or 2 more nights of this, and the entire wall would come crashing down. Abu Salam's eyes widened with righteous anger. Omar clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles cracked like walnuts. Fatima simply opened her leather folder and began to write the date, time, and a detailed description of what she was witnessing, her pen moving across the paper with calm, precise strokes. "We have seen enough," Abu Salam whispered firmly. "This is deliberate destruction of a shared boundary structure. The evidence is clear and undeniable."
The morning sun rose over the town like a golden eye slowly opening to witness the drama that was about to unfold. News of the dispute between Juha and Hassun had spread through the streets faster than fire spreads through dry wheat. By the time the courthouse doors opened, it seemed like every single person in the entire town had abandoned their shops, their fields, their kitchens, and their beds to come and watch the spectacle. Farmers stood beside merchants, children sat on their fathers' shoulders, and old women leaned out of nearby windows with cups of tea in their wrinkled hands, determined not to miss a single word. Judge Karim's courtroom was a simple but dignified space, with whitewashed walls, a high wooden ceiling supported by thick beams, and a single elevated desk where the judge sat like a king on a modest throne. Behind him hung a large green cloth embroidered with golden letters that read, "Justice is the foundation of all things." It was a phrase that Judge Karim took more seriously than he took his own heartbeat. The judge entered the room slowly, his long white robe trailing behind him like the tail of a peaceful cloud. He sat down, adjusted his spectacles on his thin nose, and looked out at the packed courtroom with an expression that suggested he had already heard about the situation and was not particularly amused by it. "Bring the parties forward," he commanded in his quiet but unmistakable voice. Juha stepped forward first, dressed in his best robe, clean and pressed, his head held high with the quiet confidence of a man who knows that truth is standing firmly on his side. Behind him stood Abu Salem, Omar the carpenter, and Fatima the record-keeper, each one radiating the kind of solid, unshakable credibility that no amount of money could buy and no amount of lies could defeat. Then Hassun stepped forward, and the contrast could not have been more dramatic. The big man who usually walked like a bull charging through a marketplace now moved with the hesitant, shuffling steps of a child who had been caught stealing sweets from the kitchen. His bright red turban was crooked on his head, his green robe was wrinkled and stained with dirt from his midnight digging, and his eyes were darting around the room like two frightened birds trapped inside a cage. He had not been able to find a single person willing to stand beside him as a witness or supporter, and he stood alone before the judge, like a tree stripped bare of all its leaves by a merciless winter wind. Judge Karim looked at both men for a long moment, then turned to Juha. "Speak," he said simply. Juha bowed respectfully and began. He spoke clearly and calmly, describing everything that had happened since Hassun moved into the neighboring house. He told the judge about the endless borrowing that was never repaid. He described Hassun's false claim that the boundary wall was built on his land. He reminded the court that this very judge had already ruled that the wall was in its correct position. And then, with the precision of a master storyteller, he described how Hassun had ignored the court's ruling and begun secretly destroying the wall's foundation under the cover of darkness, intending to collapse it and rebuild it further into Juha's property. The courtroom was so silent during Juha's testimony that you could hear the dust particles floating through the sunbeams that streamed through the high windows. Every eye was fixed on Juha, and every ear was drinking in his words, like dry earth absorbing the first rain after a long drought. When Juha finished, Judge Karim turned to the witnesses. Abu Salem stepped forward and confirmed everything Juha had said, describing in precise detail what he had seen with his own eyes that night. His voice carried the authority of a man who had never spoken a false word in 73 years of living, and the courtroom seemed to grow heavier with the weight of his testimony. Omar the carpenter followed, explaining from his professional expertise that the damage to the wall was clearly deliberate and systematic. "No rat digs out foundation stones and stacks them in a neat pile," Omar stated flatly, and a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd like a wave across a pond. Finally, Fatima stepped forward, and this was the moment that would change everything. She opened her leather folder with the careful reverence of a scholar handling a sacred text and presented the ancient parchment to Judge Karim. She explained the old law clearly and thoroughly, reading the original text aloud so that every person in the courtroom could hear it. She then presented the 2 supporting cases where the law had been applied in the past, complete with the names of the judges who had enforced it and the outcomes that had resulted. Judge Karim studied the documents for what felt like an eternity. He read every line, examined every seal, and turned every page with the meticulous attention of a man who understood that his next words would determine the fate of 2 families.
The courtroom held its collective breath like a single organism waiting for oxygen. Finally, the judge looked up. He removed his spectacles, folded them carefully, and placed them on his desk. Then he turned his gaze toward Hassoun, and that gaze was so sharp, so penetrating, so full of cold judicial authority that Hassoun visibly shrank, his massive frame somehow becoming smaller under the weight of those ancient, knowing eyes. Hassoun ibn Khalaf ibn Dawood, Judge Karim began, his voice filling the courtroom like water filling a vessel, reaching every corner and leaving no space untouched. He paused, letting the silence do its work. But instead of accepting the court's decision like an honorable man, you chose to take the law into your own hands. You chose to destroy, under cover of darkness, a boundary wall that has stood for 60 years. You chose deception over dignity. You chose theft over trust. You chose to be a destroyer rather than a builder, and in doing so you have brought shame upon yourself and your family name.
Hassoun's lower lip was trembling now, and his eyes were glistening with the beginnings of tears that his pride was desperately trying to hold back. Several women in the crowd shook their heads in disapproval, and a few elderly men clicked their tongues in the universal sound of deep disappointment. Judge Karim continued, "The ancient law presented by the witness Fatima is valid and enforceable. It has never been repealed or amended. Therefore, this court rules as follows. First, Hassoun shall rebuild the boundary wall at his own expense, in its original and correct position, using materials of equal or better quality than the original construction. The work shall be completed within 30 days. Hassoun swallowed hard, his enormous throat moving like a snake digesting a stone. Second, in accordance with Municipal Boundary Law No. 47, Hassoun shall surrender a strip of land 3 feet wide along the entire length of the shared boundary to his neighbor Juha, as compensation for the deliberate damage caused. This land transfer shall be documented officially and permanently recorded in the town registry." A gasp swept through the courtroom like wind through a wheat field. Hassoun staggered slightly, as if the words had physically struck him in the chest. 3 feet of land along the entire boundary was a significant amount of his property, and losing it was a punishment that would remind him of his foolishness every single time he looked out of his window for the rest of his life. Third, Judge Karim added, and the courtroom fell silent again, Hassoun shall return every single item he has borrowed from Juha and never returned. Every cup, every plate, every spoon, every grain of salt, everything, within 7 days. This final ruling drew a wave of quiet applause from the crowd, which Judge Karim silenced with a single raised eyebrow. He struck his desk with his wooden hammer 3 times, each strike echoing through the room like the final notes of a song. Court is dismissed. The crowd began to pour out of the courthouse, buzzing with excited conversation, everyone eager to retell the story to those who had not been present. Juha walked out into the warm sunlight and found himself surrounded by neighbors patting his back, shaking his hand, and congratulating him with smiles so wide that the entire street seemed brighter than usual. But Juha did not celebrate loudly. That was not his way. He simply smiled his quiet, knowing smile, thanked everyone politely, and walked home with Bashir the donkey trotting happily beside him, as if the animal somehow understood that justice had been served. When Juha reached his house, he walked straight to his beloved fig tree and sat down beneath its generous shade. The branches above him rustled gently in the afternoon breeze, and the leaves created a dancing pattern of light and shadow on the ground around him. He poured himself a cup of tea, took a long, slow sip, and closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, the world was quiet. Perfectly, beautifully, wonderfully quiet. 3 weeks later, the wall was rebuilt. It stood straight and strong, made of new bricks that Hassoun had paid for with money he would spend months earning back. The strip of land that Hassoun had surrendered now belonged to Juha, and Juha had planted a row of small olive trees along it, trees that would grow tall over the years and serve as a living green reminder that greed always costs more than it promises to deliver. Every borrowed item had been returned, cleaned and polished, and stacked neatly in Juha's kitchen. Hassoun had carried them over himself, one load at a time, his head bowed low,
and his voice reduced to a humble murmur that was almost unrecognizable from the booming roar that had once shaken birds from trees. And as for the relationship between the two neighbors, something unexpected happened. Hassoun, humbled and chastened by his defeat, slowly began to change. He started greeting Juha politely each morning. He stopped borrowing without returning. He even brought Juha a plate of his wife's cooking one evening, offered with a genuine apology and a shame-filled smile. Juha accepted the plate, invited Hassoun to sit under the fig tree, and poured him a cup of tea. They sat together in the fading light of sunset, two neighbors, separated by a strong new wall, but connected by something that was being slowly and carefully built between them, something far more valuable than walls or land or property. It was the beginning of respect, and from respect, in time, might even grow something resembling friendship. As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky above the quiet town, Juha looked up and whispered to no one in particular. The best walls are not the ones that keep people apart. They are the ones that teach people where they end and where others begin. And once you know that, you can finally be good neighbors. Bashir the donkey brayed softly in agreement, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing.
Juha nodded, but he wanted to make absolutely certain that there could be no possible defense, no excuse, no way for Hassoun to wiggle out of this trap. He stepped forward, cleared his throat loudly, and called out over the wall in a voice that was calm but carried clearly through the night air. "Good evening, neighbor Hassoun. Working late in your garden again, I see." The sound of digging stopped instantly. There was a moment of complete silence, the kind of silence that falls right before thunder. Then Hassoun's sweaty face appeared above the wall, his eyes wide with surprise, darting nervously left and right as he noticed the four figures standing in Juha's courtyard. "Juha, there was a rat. Yes, a large rat. I was trying to dig it out of its hole near the wall. Enormous creature, teeth like daggers, very dangerous for the children, you understand," Hassoun stammered, his voice losing its usual booming confidence and shrinking to something closer to the squeak of the imaginary rat he was describing. "A rat," Juha repeated slowly, allowing the word to hang in the air like a judge's hammer suspended before the final strike. "How interesting. And I suppose the 8 foundation stones that you have carefully removed and stacked in a neat pile beside you were also part of your rat-catching technique." Hassoun looked down at the pile of stones as if seeing them for the first time. His mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish that had been pulled out of water and suddenly realized it could not breathe. Sweat was pouring down his face in rivers, and it was no longer from the physical labor. Abu Salem stepped forward into the moonlight, his white turban glowing like a beacon of authority. "Abu Salem ibn Khalaf ibn Dawood," he said, in a voice that carried the weight of 7 decades of wisdom and respect. "I am Abu Salem, elder of this town. Beside me stand Omar the carpenter and Fatima the record-keeper. We have all witnessed with our own eyes your deliberate destruction of the boundary wall between your property and the property of Juha. We are prepared to testify to this before Judge Karim." The color drained from Hassoun's face so quickly that he turned from dark brown to pale gray in approximately 2 seconds. His shovel slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered to the ground with a metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent night. "Now wait, let us not be hasty," Hassoun began, his voice cracking like the wall he had been destroying. "This is all a misunderstanding. Between neighbors, we can surely settle this without involving judges and courts. I was simply doing some maintenance on my side of the property, no harm intended whatsoever. Let us sit down tomorrow over tea and discuss this like civilized men." Fatima stepped forward, opened her leather folder, and held up the ancient parchment so that the moonlight illuminated the faded text and the official seal at the bottom. "Are you familiar with Municipal Boundary Law number 47, enacted in the year of our calendar 214 years ago?" she asked, in a voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's knife. Hassoun stared at the parchment blankly. "I have never heard of such a law in my entire life," he admitted, and for the first time since Juha had known him, Hassoun's voice contained something it had never contained before. It contained fear.
You will hear about it tomorrow, Juha said quietly, when we stand before Judge Karim, and I promise you, Hassoon, you will remember it for the rest of your life. Juha turned and walked back towards his house, followed by his 3 witnesses. Behind him, standing alone in the ruined foundation of the wall he had been destroying, Hassoon remained frozen in the moonlight, like a statue of a man who had just realized that he had dug not just a hole in the ground, but a hole so deep that he might never be able to climb out of it. And tomorrow morning, when the sun rose over the golden hills and the birds began their songs, the final chapter of this dispute would unfold in Judge Karim's courtroom, and the entire town would gather to witness it.